Well, welcome back. We are now in part 3 of the Roland Juno-60 repair series. Now, you may have noticed at the end of part 2 that the Juno-60 had a bender panel that was free of the flexstone, granite, and a can. In this video, we're going to show you just how we got there. But first, we'll have to restore the bender panel to the point of having a smooth black finish. Then we can apply these decals and hopefully seal them to the panel. First, we'll get started and grind off that flexstone, get down to the bare metal, and see what we find.
Well, there it is. Granite in a can by Flexstone. It's finally time to grind it off. I have to say, though, this cheap solution to hide rust damage really held up well for the last 20 years. I didn't just use the Flexstone, I also put a coat of clear coat on it. I started off with some 120 grit on the orbital sander. That took care of most of it, but not so much on the face of the panel. Now we're sanding with some 100 grit, and we're getting down to bare metal. Those darker spots on the bottom left are the pitted areas from the original rust damage. Now for a little hand sanding on the edge of the openings and on the rounded edge. Then I'll give it a hit with some 180 grit on the orbital sander. Now these little pitted spots will show up through the paint unless we address this with a little spot filler. There are little imperfections everywhere, so we're going to spread it on most of the panel. Now here's how it looks after we sanded off all the excess spot filler. You can see the imperfections around the cutouts have filled in quite nicely, and so has the pitted area where the rust damaged the metal. Alright, now it's time for primer. This is actually the first take. I was using this filler/sandable primer, and it built up around the edge of the openings, making them look kinda weird. So I actually sanded that off and used a standard gray enamel primer, but I didn't get the footage of that. It looked a lot like this. Then after the primer dried, I gave it a light sanding and then I hit it with some black satin finish to get the panel back to its original color. I gave it 2 coats of that black satin.
I've been trying to come up with an idea to how to get some print on a bender panel for a while now. I thought of like silkscreen, dipping some stamps in paint, or maybe even stenciling on some characters. But the best idea was actually provided by the Synth Wizards over at Synth in New Braunfels, Texas. I was watching one of their Synth Wizards episodes. They added a 3-position switch right on the bender panel of a Roland Jupiter 4. They needed a way to add some lettering to explain just what the switch does. Then it was a blast from my past, because I forgot these things even existed. But they decided to use dry transfer lettering. You know, the white letters that come on a translucent sheet and you rub it back with a pencil. I remember doing that stuff in elementary school, but really that's it. This seemed like the perfect option for me. If it matches the Jupiter 4 characters that well, then it will definitely work with a keyboard like the Juno-60 that has the exact same lettering.
This was definitely going to be a little bit more complicated than adding a couple of words. Fortunately, I have a Juno 6 with the same bender board that is still in excellent condition. I can use this as a guide so I can recreate the print on the blank panel. My first idea was to mark the area that I wanted to fill with the word so I could be sure to make it centered. I did this with using a couple little pieces of blue tape. Then it was time to dry transfer on some letters. I totally forgot about this. I haven't used these since elementary school. The translucent paper makes it easy to line up the next letter. The eye came out a little off-centered, but the LFO trig is pretty much where I wanted it to be. After doing the word bender, I realized it was difficult to center because I had to predict a starting point. When I did the DCO and VCF above their respective slide pot lines, I realized that doing the center letter first, and then wrapping it with the following letters, makes for a nicely centered word with proper kerning. Moving further along, these next few words really came out nice, and we have some lines down now. I made the vertical lines for the bender wheel a bit too long, but that's how I'll know that this is mine. Next up, we need to make the angled lines around the volume knob. This requires a critical eye, as you have to find the dead center of the volume hole. You do this by covering half of the hole with a bevel square and deciding exactly where that half is just by how it looks. Like I said, you need a really critical eye for this step. These lines are pre-cut to the proper length. They're not easy to place, then hold, and then transfer. Next, we'll label these three positions for the octave transpose button. You can see how I'm spelling the word from the center out to get the best centered result. Now it's time for the level lines for the VCF and the DCO slide pots. There are 11 lines, 8 thin and 3 slightly thicker. We measure to find that they are about 3 millimeters apart. That will cover the full range of the slider. It should start on the 0 line and end on the 10 line. We also need to measure the line segments so they can be pre-cut. The lines in between the faders are slightly longer than the ones on the edge of the faders. So we'll measure and cut out what we need, plus a few extra. I can't expect these all to go perfectly. The first line is one of the thicker lines, along with the middle one and the last one. Using the bevel square, I try to line up the next line with the previous one, instead of measuring every time. It looks like one straight line. So far, so good. This line came out slightly curved, so I scrape it off with a guitar pick. The plastic doesn't damage the paint, and I can try again. With that process complete, it looks like this. The sliders line up with the lines from start to finish. If I did this right, the faders on the restored panel should do the same. On the original, we see that the lines of the volume knob line up with this little cutout that's on the plastic knob itself. If I did this right, the faders on the restored panel should do the same. Now to add numbers on the DCO and VCF lines. I had to go with a smaller size than I wanted to, but the next size up would overlap the lines, and I knew that would look terrible, and possibly damage something. Now it's time to lock in those dry transfer characters. If I can scrape them off easily with a small piece of plastic, it could use a good couple of coats of clear, just to protect it and lock everything in. I got satin clear coat because the original paint isn't as shiny as semi-gloss. After spraying it on, it seemed to pull away from the characters, and I was a bit worried that this would dry looking terrible. And it kinda did. You can see how the sheen changes around the characters. So I gave it a light sanding with 320, and then I sprayed another coat. This looks much better. It seems to be a nice and even coat this time. Now that it's dry and cured, the final product is quite satisfying. The dry transfer characters are protected under a smooth, clear layer. The sheen looks excellent and goes well with the satin finish on the new end caps. Since it was hard to see the bender wheel replacement on the first Juno-60 video, I made sure to get a better camera angle on this one. We start with removing the set screw. Note that the slot in the potentiometer stem is parallel to the set screw. We need to be sure that it goes back that way, so the bender will stay properly calibrated. Next up, push the stem in, and pull the old bender wheel right off. I got a clear wheel this time, so I may add an LED on the next installment of the Juno-60 restoration series. We'll move the spring over to the new one, but trying to set it beforehand is definitely not recommended. I'd also like to take this moment to note that I did find a proper size washer and nut to secure the volume potentiometer to the metal support bracket. The old bumpers are stuck, and they're not in the best condition anyways. So, I'll cut a couple pieces of this heat shrink tube, and I'll use those as a set of new bumpers, and install them on the bender wheel. Now it's time to set the spring and put the wheel back on the potentiometer stem. It's not easy holding the wheel with one hand. It's best to hold it with a hand on either side, using your fingers to keep the spring from jumping off. Then you can press it on with your thumbs. I just need a slight adjustment to make sure the pot stem is centered. I'm making sure that the line on the top is parallel with the set screw and the bender stem. Next I'll install the set screw. And then check the operation. Alright, now we can mount this board back in the panel and add a couple screws to keep it in place. Then, with the plastic spacer lined up properly, we'll install the screws that hold the bender wheel assembly to the face of the panel. After that, I'll put the rest of the screws in the circuit board. Now with the volume knob and slider caps, we can see if the lines do it justice. We could see the caps line up just properly just before I aimed it away from the camera. The volume marks line up just perfectly. It's done and looks nice. Time to install it alongside these new end caps. We'll clip in these wire harnesses and screw in the ground. The 4 screws that hold the panel to the base are installed. I am pretty blown away at this point. That satin finish is just right. Those end caps definitely make up for not being made to original factory specs. I use these end cap templates to help make some much needed Juno cases. I wanted the cases to hold the keyboard in place and have plenty of space all around the knobs and sliders. So using these end caps, I actually made little angles in the top of the keyboard case. These little surfaces that are masked off here will actually get a 1/2 inch of foam rubber on them, and the foam rubber will rest against the end caps on the keyboard and hold it in place when the case is closed. I made 2 cases for the 2 different keyboards. I chose to finish one with a black cherry stain and the other one with the ebony stain.
So here's the keyboard right here. There's a break right here in the divider, so the keyboard can be stored in the side pocket, even though it's still fixed. Now these angled pieces have a 1/2 inch of foam rubber that rests on these hardwood end caps. This holds the keyboard in place, and it ensures that the potentiometers are not being pressed on, by the top of the case. If they were being pressed on, you'd see their indent, somewhere in here, but they don't get to touch it. This one that lays perfectly on this angle, and when this case is closed, this keyboard doesn't move. So, in conclusion, that's how you restore a bender panel for a Roland Juno-60. It looks really accurate to the original. Honestly, I love it. It came out amazing. Better than I could have hoped for, anyways. So there may be a part 4, as I would like to remove the flexstone right off the base and off this front edge of the keyboard right here. There's actually kind of a matching flexstone back about this high on the back. Most of it's black. There are some mute transistors like right into the board right here, and I think they need to be replaced. I have some new ones, and with some luck, if everything works out the way I'm hoping, that'll remove the distortion that I'm getting on the VCA level when I'm above 75%. I also added that clear bender wheel, so I'm thinking about also adding an LED down here just to make it glow. I'm thinking blue, but we'll see. But there's a lot of other projects I'm sure are going to come beforehand. So thanks for tuning in, and feel free to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you again in the next video.